Something happened last night that you may not have seen coming, while you were going about your life, thinking about ordinary things. Someone was quietly watching, listening, and paying attention to details you never realized mattered. A question was asked. A situation unfolded. A small test was placed in front of you without anyone announcing that it was a test, and what happened next changed the way someone looked at you. You may have thought your actions were unnoticed. You may have believed that the little things you did, the patience you showed, the kindness you offered, and the moments when you chose silence instead of anger simply disappeared into the background, but they didn't. Someone noticed, and according to the story unfolding around this message, the person who noticed was not prepared for what they discovered. There was something they expected to find in you. They expected impatience. They expected resentment. They expected you to react emotionally. They expected you to reveal something that would confirm their doubts. Instead, they discovered something completely different. They discovered a side of you that could not easily be explained. They discovered that you were stronger than they thought. They discovered that you could care without demanding attention. They discovered that you could walk away from situations that once would have pulled you into unnecessary conflict. They discovered that your heart had changed, and somewhere along the way, that discovery reached your soulmate. That is where the emotional part of this story begins, because your soulmate may have been carrying questions about you for much longer than you realize, questions that were never fully spoken. Questions such as, can I trust this person? Would they still care if they didn't receive anything in return? Would they remain kind when nobody was watching? Would they understand me if I could not explain everything? Would they stay true to themselves when circumstances became difficult? These questions may have existed quietly beneath the surface, and then someone decided to find the answers. Not necessarily through some dramatic confrontation, not necessarily through a direct conversation. Sometimes people test others through small moments. They observe how someone responds when plans change. They notice how someone speaks about people who are not present. They pay attention to whether someone keeps promises. They watch what happens when there is nothing to gain. They notice whether kindness disappears when appreciation disappears. And last night, according to the emotional story behind this message, something happened that revealed more than anyone expected. You passed a test you didn't even know you were taking. But here's what makes this so powerful. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't performing. You weren't trying to prove that you were worthy. You were simply being yourself. That is why the discovery had such an impact. When someone is deliberately trying to look good, people can sometimes sense it. But when goodness appears naturally, quietly, and consistently, it carries a different kind of weight. That may be what someone discovered about you. They discovered that your heart did not need an audience. They discovered that your kindness wasn't always dependent on receiving kindness first. They discovered that you could be hurt without becoming cruel. They discovered that you could experience disappointment without turning it into revenge. They discovered that you could care deeply while still learning how to protect your peace, and this discovery may have reached your soulmate at a moment when they were emotionally vulnerable. Imagine hearing something about someone you care about that completely changes your understanding of them. Imagine believing one thing for a long time and then suddenly realizing that you may have misunderstood the entire situation. That realization can be overwhelming. It can bring relief. It can bring regret. It can bring tears. And that is the emotional center of this message. Your soulmate may have realized that some of the distance, confusion, or uncertainty between you was built on assumptions rather than truth. Maybe they thought you had moved on. Maybe they thought you didn't care. Maybe they believed you were stronger than you actually felt. Maybe they thought your silence meant indifference. Maybe they interpreted your boundaries as rejection. Maybe they assumed that because you stopped chasing an answer, you stopped caring about the person involved. But the truth may have been much more complicated. Sometimes silence does not mean someone has stopped caring. Sometimes silence means they are tired of explaining themselves. Sometimes distance does not mean the heart has forgotten. Sometimes distance means someone has finally learned that love cannot be forced, and sometimes walking away from a situation is not giving up. It is choosing peace. That may have been the very thing someone noticed about you. They watched how you handled something. They expected one response. You gave them another, and suddenly they had to reconsider everything. This is where the hidden test becomes important. A test can reveal what words cannot. Someone can say, "I am loyal." But behavior reveals loyalty. Someone can say, "I am patient." But circumstances reveal patience. Someone can say, "I care." But difficult moments reveal how deeply they care, and you may have demonstrated something without realizing you were demonstrating anything at all. Perhaps someone intentionally created an opportunity to see whether you would react. Perhaps they waited to see whether you would become jealous, angry, impatient, or defensive. Perhaps they expected you to expose yourself through your reaction. But instead, you remained calm. Maybe you chose not to argue. Maybe you refused to speak badly about someone. Maybe you helped when you didn't have to. Maybe you offered forgiveness without pretending that everything was acceptable. Maybe you simply continued living your life. Whatever the specific situation was, the emotional message remains the same. Someone discovered that your character was deeper than they assumed, and that discovery mattered. It mattered because your soulmate may have been struggling with their own uncertainty. There are moments when a person can become trapped between what they feel and what they believe. The heart says one thing, the mind says another. Fear says, "Protect yourself." Hope says, "Maybe there is still something worth understanding." Pride says, "Don't reach out." The heart whispers, "But what if I misunderstood?" That inner conflict can become exhausting, and sometimes all it takes is one piece of new information to change everything. Last night may have been one of those moments. Someone learned something about you. Then your soulmate learned it too, and suddenly, an old memory may have looked different, a conversation may have sounded different, a moment of silence may have carried a different meaning. A decision you made months ago may have suddenly made sense. Your soulmate may have remembered something you once said and realized they had misunderstood it. They may have remembered the way you looked at them. They may have remembered your patience. They may have remembered how you tried to understand them even when they were difficult to understand. And those memories may have returned all at once. That is when emotions can become impossible to hide. Sometimes tears do not come because someone is weak. They come because someone has been holding too much inside for too long. Tears can represent relief, regret, gratitude, love, confusion, the realization that something mattered more than expected. Your soulmate's emotional reaction, in the story of this message, is connected to that realization. They may have discovered that you were never the person they feared you might be. They may have discovered that you were more sincere than they believed. They may have discovered that you didn't need to manipulate anyone to be noticed. You didn't need to demand attention. You didn't need to create drama. You didn't need to compete. You simply remained yourself, and that can be surprisingly powerful. There is something deeply moving about realizing that someone you once misunderstood was quietly doing their best all along. Maybe you were imperfect. Maybe you made mistakes. Maybe there were moments when you could have communicated better. Maybe there were things you wished you had said. But being imperfect does not erase sincerity, and perhaps someone finally understood that. Your soulmate may have realized that they had been judging your actions without knowing the story behind them. They may have looked at your silence and assumed you didn't care. They may have looked at your boundaries and assumed you were cold. They may have looked at your independence and assumed you didn't need anyone. They may have looked at your strength and never considered how much effort it took to remain strong. But now, something has shifted. The person who tested you may have unintentionally revealed the truth. And the truth may have been much more beautiful than the suspicion. Think about how strange it is when someone secretly watches you expecting to find evidence against you and instead finds evidence of your character. That kind of discovery can be humbling. It can make someone question their own assumptions. It can make them think about every time they doubted you, every time they held back, every time they believed fear instead of evidence, every time they listened to someone else's opinion instead of observing you directly. And your soulmate may now be asking themselves a difficult question: what if I was wrong? That question can change a person's entire emotional landscape. Because admitting that you were wrong about someone you care about requires humility, it requires honesty, it requires letting go of pride, and perhaps that is what happened last night. Something broke through the wall of certainty. Someone learned something, your soulmate heard it, and suddenly the story they had been telling themselves no longer fit the facts. That can be emotional. That can bring tears. That can make a person sit quietly and think about the past. Maybe they looked at an old message. Maybe they remembered an old conversation. Maybe they revisited a place that reminded them of you. Maybe they simply sat alone with their thoughts, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to acknowledge something they had been avoiding. You mattered, not because of some perfect fantasy, not because everything between you had always been easy. You mattered because something about the connection left an impression that they could not simply erase. But there is another part of this message that deserves your attention. The test wasn't necessarily about whether you were perfect. It may have been about whether you were genuine, and those are two very different things. Perfection is impossible. Genuineness is a choice. You can make mistakes and still be genuine. You can have boundaries and still be loving. You can protect yourself and still care. You can disagree with someone without disrespecting them. You can walk away without wishing harm upon anyone. You can feel deeply without allowing emotion to control every decision. Maybe that is what someone discovered about you. They discovered balance. they discovered maturity, they discovered emotional depth, and perhaps your soulmate had never fully recognized those qualities before. This is why the story feels bigger than a simple secret test. The real discovery was not just about what you did, it was about who you are. There is a difference between an action and a character trait. Anyone can be kind once, but consistency tells another story. Anyone can apologize once, but accountability tells another story. Anyone can say they care, but how they behave when nobody is watching tells a deeper story. Maybe your soulmate received evidence of that deeper story, and it shook them, because now they have to reconsider what they believed. They may have realized that your connection was never as simple as they tried to make it. They may have realized that the distance between you did not erase the emotional significance. They may have realized that they still have questions, and questions can be powerful because questions keep the door of possibility open. You don't have to force that door open. You don't have to chase anyone. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to spend your days trying to decode every little sign. Your role is simpler. Keep becoming the strongest, healthiest version of yourself. Let your actions speak. Let time reveal what words cannot. Let people show you who they are. And if someone truly wants to understand you, let them do the work of understanding. Because you should not have to live your life constantly proving that you are worthy of being trusted. The person who secretly tested you may have learned something important. You are not as easy to manipulate as they expected. You are not as desperate for approval as they assumed. You are capable of standing on your own. And perhaps your soulmate found that realization both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because independence can be attractive in the healthiest sense. Painful because they may have realized that you could continue your life without waiting forever for them. That realization can create urgency, not unhealthy urgency, not panic, but the awareness that every relationship requires participation. You cannot build something meaningful through assumptions alone. At some point, someone has to communicate. Someone has to become honest. Someone has to stop hiding behind fear. Maybe last night was the beginning of that realization. Maybe the person who tested you didn't expect the information to travel further. Maybe they thought they were simply satisfying their own curiosity. But what they discovered was too significant to remain hidden, and when your soulmate heard it, their emotional defenses began to weaken. Think of all the moments when people protect themselves because they are afraid of being disappointed. They tell themselves they don't care. They pretend they are unaffected. They become distant. They convince themselves that moving on is easier than asking questions. But sometimes one unexpected truth exposes all those defenses. Your soulmate may have realized that their feelings were not as settled as they claimed. They may have realized that they were still carrying unresolved emotions, and suddenly, the past became present again. That does not mean you should assume a specific person is destined to return or that every coincidence is a supernatural sign. Instead, take this message as an emotional reflection. It is about what happens when hidden assumptions are replaced with real evidence. It is about the power of character. It is about the possibility that someone may understand you differently after seeing your actions clearly. And most importantly, it is about remembering your own value without needing someone else's reaction to confirm it. Because here is the part nobody can take away from you. You know the moments when you chose patience. You know the times you stayed respectful when it would have been easier to become bitter. You know the private battles you faced. You know how many times you wanted to say something but chose peace instead. You know the moments when you gave people grace. And even if nobody noticed, those choices still mattered. Sometimes the greatest growth happens when there is no audience. Sometimes your most important transformation happens quietly. Nobody applauds it. Nobody posts about it. Nobody tells you that you did a good job. But you know. And one day, someone else may notice. 2. Perhaps that is the deeper message behind this entire story. Your life does not need to become a performance. You don't need to constantly prove that you are good enough. You don't need to pass secret tests. You need to live according to your values. When you do that, people eventually reveal themselves. Those who genuinely respect you will recognize your consistency. Those who want to manipulate you will become frustrated because you cannot easily be controlled. Those who misunderstand you may eventually learn more. And those who truly care will eventually have to confront their own assumptions. Your soulmate's tears, symbolically, represent that emotional confrontation, the moment when the heart realizes something the mind resisted, the moment when someone says internally, "I didn't see this clearly before." The moment when regret and gratitude exist at the same time. Maybe they regret not trusting you sooner. Maybe they regret allowing other people's opinions to influence them. Maybe they regret staying silent. Maybe they regret making assumptions. And maybe, beneath all of that, they feel grateful that the truth finally surfaced. Because sometimes the truth arrives late. But late truth can still be meaningful. It can still teach. It can still heal. It can still change the direction of a relationship. However, don't allow this message to convince you that you must wait indefinitely for someone else. Your life is happening now. Your growth is happening now. Your future is being built now. If someone wants to be part of that future, they should eventually demonstrate it through respectful, consistent actions, not secret tests, not confusing games, not manipulation, not endless uncertainty. Healthy connection requires honesty. So if someone truly learned something about you last night, let that discovery become their responsibility. They can decide what to do with it. They can communicate. They can apologize. They can explain. They can take meaningful action. You don't have to chase them down and demand that they understand. Your worth does not depend on whether they do. And that is perhaps the most powerful shift of all. Imagine the difference between saying, "I need them to realize my value," and saying, "I know my value, and whoever enters my life must respect it." The second position is stronger. It is calmer. It is healthier. It gives love room to grow without turning love into desperation. Maybe your soulmate is learning that lesson too. Maybe they are realizing that caring about someone means seeing them as they are, not as fear describes them. Maybe they are realizing that trust must be built through communication rather than assumptions. Maybe they are realizing that a person can be strong and sensitive at the same time. Maybe they are realizing that your silence was not emptiness, it was restraint. Your distance was not hatred, it was protection. Your patience was not weakness, it was maturity. Your kindness was not an invitation to be taken advantage of. It was simply part of who you chose to become, and when someone discovers that, it can change everything. The emotional reaction may come because they suddenly understand the cost of your silence. They may realize how many moments they misread. They may remember times when you were reaching for understanding while they were retreating into fear. They may recognize that you gave them more grace than they deserved at the time. And that realization can be painful, but pain can also become a teacher. If your soulmate is genuinely reflecting, perhaps they are learning not to repeat the same patterns. Perhaps they are asking themselves what they need to change. Perhaps they are learning that communication matters. Perhaps they are learning that assumptions create distance. Perhaps they are learning that people cannot be understood from one moment alone. You are more than the worst thing.